Good day. In this further video about the conflict in Ukraine, I'm going to deal with the topic of disinformation. But before I do, just a very few brief words about the overall military situation in eastern Ukraine. The latest reports that I've seen suggest that the most important single fact that's happened over the last couple of hours or days is that the governor of the Ukrainian governor of Lugansk province has now apparently admitted that the town of Severodonetsk, one of the key places that are still occupied by the Ukrainian forces in Lugansk region, that town is now almost entirely physically surrounded by Russian and allied forces, and that the garrison there, the Ukrainian garrison there, is likely to be completely trapped before long. That also appears to be the case of the Ukrainian garrison in the village, or rather large village or small town of Liman, which is en route to the more important center of Slavyansk. Now, a couple of days ago, about a week ago, there were rumors that the Ukrainian authorities, recognizing that the force in Severodonetsk was holding unsustainable positions, would be withdrawn from the city, and that there would be a concentration instead on trying to defend another city in Lugansk province, which is Lysychansk, which is the town, by the way, where the Ukrainians have set up their administration for Lugansk region. Well, entirely predictably, that didn't happen. The story of the Ukrainian conflict is that the Ukrainians never retreat willingly from any position that they occupy. They try and dig in and hold out for as long as they can, absorbing immense losses in the process. And it looks as if the garrison in Severodonetsk, as a consequence of this, I think, misconceived strategy, is now facing encirclement and presumably at some point eventual destruction. I have to say that, again, I find this attitude of Western governments that they appear to be encouraging Ukraine to stand and fight in unsustainable positions, extremely strange and in some ways even immoral. Now, I say that because, of course, we've now had a whole series of reports from especially the British Defence Ministry, but also to some extent from some officials in the United States connected to the Pentagon. I'm not going to say the Pentagon itself, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we've also had various comments from these officials about how the Russian advance in Donbass is a slow, anemic, minimal, whatever. It is only slow, minimal, or anemic because the Ukrainians, at immense loss, are clinging on to what are ultimately undefendable positions. The result is that the Ukrainian military is being systematically destroyed, trying to cling on to these positions. Now, if you read Western histories of the Second World War, you will find endless repetitions of criticism of the policy of the German High Command and indeed of the German leader of that period. You all know whom I'm talking about his supposedly ludicrous, sometimes even regarded as irrational, stand and fight orders, which he allegedly gave to the German army holding out in various parts of the World War II conflict. Now, I ought to say that I understand that academic history has now heavily revised this appreciation of German tactics during the Second World War, and it's now widely thought that these criticisms that have been made of the German leadership were wrong or were not factually based. Regardless whether or not that is the case, it is fascinating to see how the fact that the Germans during the Second World War were criticized for irrational stand and fight orders, even in impossible situations, is now apparently forgotten when the Ukrainians also engage or undertake irrational stand and fight orders. And whilst I'm on the subject, it seems that President Zelensky of Ukraine once again adamantly refuses to allow the garrison of the Azovstal factory to surrender, and he now says that he's trying to negotiate the evacuation of the troops in that factory to a third country, something which the Russians have repeatedly ruled out. And taking that stance only prolongs the agony of that garrison in the Azovstal factory to no useful purpose that I can see. Anyway, since this is going to be a program about disinformation, I should say that it is only appropriate to add that the Ukrainian military itself did carry out some advances in the northern part of Kharkiv region. They carried out a counteroffensive, as they put it, against not so much Russian forces as I understand it, but the Lugansk militia that was occupying certain villages north of Kharkiv. The militia apparently pulled back from some of these villages, and the Ukrainian military was able to reoccupy them. Now, apparently the number of forces deployed by each side in this area is very small. The concentrations are thin. And in every case, it's when one goes over this, these are basically positional battles. The forces in Kharkiv region, in this part of Russia, Kharkiv region, deployed by the Russians and their allies, seem to be more a covering force to protect the flanks of the major Russian military concentrations further south in places like ETHEREUM and, of course, in Lugansk. And these operations that we've just seen apparently don't actually affect the main battle. They're not such as to put significant pressure, or indeed any appreciable pressure, on the Russians as they focus on their main objective in Donbass. But as I said, it would not be a complete update if I didn't report the fact that in one part of the theatre in northern Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians did achieve certain advances. And that, of course, brings me to the main topic of my programme, because if you were following events in Ukraine yesterday, you would have seen reports all over independent media, and also in some mainstream media outlets, including The Independent in Britain, various tabloids in Britain, the Jerusalem Post newspaper, and indeed several news agencies, that the Ukrainians had either successfully attacked or had sunk the Admiral Makarov frigate, which is one of the most advanced frigates in the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And supposedly this had been done again with Neptune anti-ship missiles, which had supposedly struck this frigate close to Snake Island, not far, in other words, from where the Moskva had its, well, we don't quite know what accident, suffered the missile attack, who knows? But anyway, there were lots of stories about this yesterday. And when one goes and examines where this information came from Ukraine. It came from Ukrainian sites, but apparently it had its origins in the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. I should say that the information seems to have been filtered through various Ukrainian media sites. I'm not sure that it came directly from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, but certainly that was the impression that was given. Anyway, it became increasingly clear over the course of the day that this story about the Admiral Makarov having been struck by missiles was wrong. And sure enough, the Admiral Makarov has now turned up intact and undamaged in Sevastopol, the major base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. So clearly those reports were untrue. And I would add that it's striking to see that all these media outlets, the tabloids in Britain, various news agencies and all of those, which covered the story yesterday about the attack on the Admiral Makarov, I've not yet seen one of them come out and say that this story was untrue and is now retracted. And this, of course, follows a regular pattern of misinformation. I'm going to use the word, propaganda, if you like, in war. And of course, we've had all kinds of incidents. We've had the Ghost of Kiev story, the Ukrainian pilot who single-handed shot down 40 Ukrainian Russian aircraft and did it all by himself, and who was supposedly shot down by the Russians in March, but who it turns out never existed. We've had the incident in Snake Island right at the start of the war, when Ukrainian border guards refused to surrender to the Russians, sent a swear word to the Russian Black Sea Fleet when they were called upon to surrender, fought heroically to the last man, only it turned out that they did surrender. And over the last couple of days, we've had some more exercises in what I would call similar war propaganda. Only rather disturbingly, they've not come from Ukraine itself. They've come from certain anonymous officials talking to journalists in the United States, to the New York Times and to NBC. And one report claimed that the United States had provided targeting information which enabled Ukraine to kill 12 Russian generals across the battlefield. There was also another report that followed shortly after, which said that the United States also provided Ukraine with some intelligence which enabled Ukraine to launch its allegedly successful missile strike on Moscow. Now, I'm going to say straight away that propaganda is a normal part of war. Every side in war engages in it. The Russians are engaging in it also. And I want to say this because one of the features of Russian Defense Ministry statements, bulletins about the war, is that whilst the information that they provide is accurate enough, it does provide us with a fairly good picture of the missile strikes that the Russians are launching across Ukraine. They don't at any point actually publish information about Russian withdrawals, Russian setbacks, anything of that kind. And of course, propaganda can be by omission as well as by commission. If the Russians are not providing information about the inevitable setbacks that they must suffer, then that is propaganda by omission. You get bulletins that give you a completely one-sided view about how the war is progressing. Having said that, those bulletins nonetheless do seem to be accurate up to a point. Again, I want to stress the words up to a point. The Russians in these bulletins make claims about the numbers of Ukrainian soldiers they've killed. They put them in the hundreds every day. They make claims about the number of armored forces, tanks and armored vehicles of Ukraine that they've destroyed. They now claim that they've destroyed somewhere in the region of 2,800. One doesn't have to accept these particular claims as true. And it does seem to me that there is a good reason to be skeptical about some of the armoured vehicle loss claims. Specifically, when General Rudskoy, the operational chief of the Russian General Staff, gave an assessment of the war on 25th March 2022, he claimed that at the start of the conflict, Ukraine had 2,400 or so tanks and armoured vehicles in its armoured vehicle fleet. Now, if the Russians have destroyed 2,800 tanks and armoured vehicles, then they have arguably destroyed more tanks and armoured vehicles than Ukraine apparently possessed in its forces at the start of the war. Now, as I said, it's actually possible to reconcile these claims. If you parse General Rudskoy's words carefully, the forces, the tanks and armoured vehicles he was talking about seem to have been the tanks and armoured vehicles that were actually in service with Ukrainian combat units at the start of the war, and apparently did not include tanks and armoured vehicles in reserve. But nonetheless, it is striking that the Russians are now claiming that they've destroyed more Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles than Ukraine had at the start of the war. And they've not provided the kind of explanation for this discrepancy which I myself have just provided, which does make one wonder. Perhaps that isn't the correct explanation. Perhaps the Russians are overstating the number of tanks and armoured vehicles they've destroyed, or perhaps Ukraine had more tanks and armoured vehicles than the Russians were aware of at the start of the war. Well, who knows? But anyway, here again we see another example of propaganda, if you like, by omission. But Ukraine, of course, has engaged in propaganda of its own, and this, as I said, has tended to be more a case of propaganda by commission. I've talked about the ghost of Kiev. I've talked about the heroic last stand on Snake Island, which never happened. I've talked about other things too. The Admiral Makarov story. And by the way, there have been other cases when Ukraine has claimed to have sunk Russian warships, which it turns out were not sunk. There was a corvette, a rather modern corvette, possessed by the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Vasil Bykov, which Ukraine also claimed to have sunk, and which also turned out alive, well, intact and safe in Sevastopol a few days later. So Ukraine does engage in quite a lot of this information. And I'm afraid one has to say, so do some of these officials who are talking to the American media, like the New York Times, NBC. And if we talk about the case of the dead Russian generals, the 12 dead Russian generals, I'm going to say straight away that I'm deeply skeptical, very skeptical, that Russian losses do indeed amount, that 12 Russian generals have indeed been killed over the course of the fighting in Ukraine. As the Moon of Alabama blog has correctly pointed out, the Russians have confirmed the death of two generals. One who was killed at the very first days of the war, and another general who was killed over the course of the fighting in Mariupol. They've never admitted to any of the other deaths. And in fact, there's no evidence that I've seen that these people are indeed dead. I would add that there's been at least one case where Ukraine has claimed the death of a senior Russian commander, the captain of the Moskva cruiser, who turned up alive and well a few days later at a ceremony in Sevastopol. So we mustn't assume that these claims about dead Russian generals are true. The Moon of Alabama, by the way, is deeply skeptical. Is not only merely skeptical about that story, it actually says that it is BS, that it is untrue, that it would be impossible for the Russians to conceal the death of generals in that kind of way, and that it would not make any sense for them to do so. It would be far more demoralizing to the Russian military to conceal the death of generals rather than as opposed to simply admitting that they'd been killed over the course of the battle. But anyway, regardless of whether that's right or wrong, the point is that this story originates only from the Ukrainian side. It has no basis in any claim. It is not confirmed by the Russian side, and we've already seen that some claims made by Ukraine over the course of this fighting have proved to be wrong. Another case in point, which I am sure is wrong, is that some of these same officials who've been talking to the American media have claimed that the United States played some kind of role in the shooting down of an Ilyushin 76 transport aircraft, which is supposedly shot down with, I believe, 200 Russian personnel on board. And apparently this was right at the start of the war. Supposedly this Ilyushin crashed and all of these people were killed. Jacob Dreisen, in his invaluable reports on the Dreisen Report, has repeatedly pointed out that the Ukrainians have provided no evidence, no corroborative evidence of the truth of this story. An Ilyushin 76 is a bigger, heavier aircraft than a Boeing 737. If anything like that had actually happened, the wreckage would have been strewn all over the place, and we'd have had hundreds of dead bodies. No pictures or photos of that sort of thing have circulated anywhere in any part of the internet that I've seen. And in fact, the absence of that kind of photographic information, to my mind, confirms that that incident never took place. So we've had others. We've had all these very inflated claims, or rather these very dramatic claims about Russian losses. Now, I've already expressed some skepticism, or at least, a certain grain of skepticism about Russian claims of Ukrainian losses. Though I would say that the fact that Ukraine is now sending reservists, older reservists, into the battle, whatever the explanation for that is, maybe they're holding their younger, better trained troops back as they try to rebuild their armed forces in the rear. I'm skeptical about that, by the way, but maybe maybe that's the explanation. But whatever it is, the fact remains that it does seem as if Ukraine is running out of trained manpower to send to the battlefronts, and also does seem to be extremely short of equipment. We see far too many pictures now of Ukrainian forces maneuvering in civilian vehicles, not in tanks or armoured vehicles, which must make one believe that even if those Russian claims about equipment losses, Ukrainian equipment losses, armoured vehicle losses are exaggerated, they must come with some element of truth behind them. Whereas I have to say that I am much more skeptical, much more doubtful about the extraordinarily huge claims about Russian losses. Again, they don't seem to me to be corroborated by sufficient photographic or film evidence from the battlefields. We have seen pictures of knocked out Russian tanks. We saw them, for example, in that town in the northern suburbs of Kiev, where a major atrocity is alleged to have taken place. But nothing like on the kind of scale. We've not seen these sort of equipment losses on anything like the sort of scale that one would expect if these claims were true. And I say that because the BBC has now carried out a report, an investigation, to try to verify Russian losses. And it came up with a figure based on open reports of, funerals, post reports in newspapers, those sort of things, of just over 2,000, of whom 20% were officers. Now, the BBC says that this figure is almost certainly a huge understatement. I don't know why it assumes that, because I'm not sure that it is. And reading the BBC piece, I have to say that I got the distinct impression that the BBC was rather disappointed that it could only come up after what was clearly an exhaustive investigation with a much smaller total for Russian losses than some of the inflated claims that we've been seeing circulating around. And I've heard reports, by the way, that the militia in the Donbass has suffered losses in the order of 1,600 men killed, which again seems to me roughly in line with what I would have expected, given the complexities and intensities of the battle, but once more seems to be very far away from some of the more exaggerated claims that we've seen coming from various sources, all the more so since, as I discussed in my program yesterday, it's the militia from the Donbass which appears to be playing a disproportionately large role in much of the ground fighting in Donbass at the present time. So what the point I'm trying to make in this program is this. Fog of war is always a part of every war. Propaganda is a part of every war. But what is completely wrong, what makes absolutely no sense, what is something that I find deeply unprofessional, is the way in which some sections of the media in the West, in fact, not some, pretty much the entirety of the media in the West, simply reproduces Ukrainian claims and reports them as true. I remember that they did exactly the same during the fighting back in 2014. For example, they gave an impression of rapid Ukrainian advances, of collapsing resistance in the face of the advancing Ukrainian army as it closed in on the militias in Donbass, even as it was becoming increasingly clear that Ukraine was hurtling to defeat. And when that defeat eventually came, after weeks of fighting that began in the first days of April and dragged on until the middle of August, when that final collapse suddenly came in late August, the Western media had no real explanation for it other than to blame Russia, which of course distorted the understanding of the 2014 war and continues to do so ever since. And I'm afraid that the Western media this time is making exactly the same mistake. And the trouble is that there's a risk that this is now creating a positive feedback loop, in the sense that Ukrainian propaganda claims, some of which are, I suspect, not intended to be taken seriously. There is a long article in today's Financial Times about Ukrainian plans to launch some great counteroffensive to recapture Kherson region. There have been talk about Ukrainian counteroffensives to capture Kherson region for weeks. When these claims are circulated by Ukraine, partly intended, I suspect, to keep Ukrainian troops motivated and still fighting, well, when the Western media reports them, when Western government reports them as true, they then get fed back to Ukraine itself, and they make it more difficult for Ukrainian officials to then adjust their strategies and their tactics to take into account the real situation, because they then become trapped in a narrative, which of course they've constructed themselves, but one which has little actual connection to reality. So I think that this is dangerous and it is unwise, and it is probably prolonging the war, and it may be contributing to those errors in strategy which I discussed at the outset of this program. Ukrainian decisions to hold fast, trying to defend undefendable positions, even at the price of immensely heavy losses, for no possible, intelligible, strategic gain. Now, over the course of yesterday, I also received reports that Ukraine is now going to try and launch some sort of counteroffensive in Lugansk region. This counteroffensive will presumably be carried out in the face of overwhelming Russian firepower. It's difficult to imagine that it could succeed. And one wonders again whether the only reason why Ukraine is really going to launch a counteroffensive like this is because it is trying in some way to bring the events on the ground into line with the narrative of those events which it is spreading and which the Western media is reproducing. So I hope that this ultimately changes, and I hope that we finally learn the lesson of incidents like that of the Admiral Makarov, the Russian frigate that was sunk but which was never even damaged, and that we start understanding that we have to apply a more rigorous approach to this war and report events as they're really happening. Now, that does sometimes mean, I'm afraid, that because of information doesn't always come through very quickly, that there is a delay in reporting events. Sometimes I find myself scanning reports from the various sources which I consider reliable and finding that there's very little actual new information in them, and therefore I discuss other things. But it's better to do that than to start chasing ghosts like the ghost of Kiev or the sunk Admiral Makarov or the 10 dead Russian generals, and start to develop a whole narrative of the war based on myths like that. One day there will have to be a proper reckoning about what has happened over the course of this war, and it may not be an easy one for the West to come to terms with if the outcome is, as I fully expect, a Russian victory, not just in Donbass, but in Ukraine itself. It is better to prepare for that possibility now, rather than wait until that event happens. I have spoken to people, Germans, who lived in Germany during the Second World War, who were passionately engaged in the war, believed the stories that they were being told, and were bitterly disillusioned and severely disorientated when it turned out that those stories were false. I wouldn't want the same to happen to people in the West. Well, that's all I'm going to say today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Remember, if you are watching any of our videos on Rumble, you can press the red maroon button at the top of the video, and that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can become a member of our Locals community, participating, for example, in my Locals live streams, which take place exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And of course, you can find us on other platforms like ODYSEE and SuperU. And of course, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And you should also check out our shop and find the great things, t-shirts, magic mugs, hats, whatever, that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.